and I've never forgot that example. I also had the opportunity to work in Russia. And in 1992, I went to Nizhny Novgorod, which was Gorky during the Soviet Union. And there was a young mayor in Nizhny Novgorod. And he wanted his town, his country, to be free. And he decided that he was going to privatize the businesses in his town, and we were helping him. And I'll never forget sitting across the table from him, listening to him talk about freedom, and listening to him talk about what it meant to be able to lead his people to achieve their freedom. This man's name was Boris Nemtsov, and he was subsequently murdered by thugs at the instruction of Vladimir Putin, murdered because he was a threat to Putin, because he stood for freedom. I worked in Warsaw in 1990, and I will never forget, there was a young woman who, I was working in the embassy, she was a young Polish woman who was also working in our embassy there. And I remember talking to her, and I remember she said to me, "I'm so afraid that people will forget. I'm so afraid that people will forget what it was like to live under Soviet domination." And at the time, I remember thinking, nobody could forget that. How could you forget? But people do. And they forget the price of freedom. I also had the opportunity to talk with Natan Sharansky, who was in the Soviet Gulag for a number of years. And I remember Natan saying to me a story that he's told many people, which is that when he was in the Gulag, he and his fellow prisoners passed messages to each other about Ronald Reagan and about the message of Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan telling them that the United States stood with them, that we stood with those prisoners, that we stood for people who were prisoners of conscience, who were fighting for their freedom, and how much it meant to them. A few years ago, I met a young man, he's my age, so I think he's a young man. I met a man who escaped from Cuba when he was 14. And he got on a boat by himself, came to the United States. And I asked him, I said, "How did you know? You're 14 years old, this was before the internet. I said, how did you know that you should risk everything to come to America? What gave you that confidence?" And without missing a beat, he said, "The speeches of Ronald Reagan." And I asked him how he had heard the speeches of Ronald Reagan. And he said that he and his family had a radio. And at night, they would listen to the radio with a blanket over their heads so the neighbors couldn't hear. But they were able to get Radio Marti, and they heard Ronald Reagan speaking of freedom. I had an amazing experience here at the Reagan Library a few years ago. I was meeting with the defense minister from one of the Baltic countries. And we were talking, and I told him that story. And he looked at me and he said, "I had the same thing happen to me. That's my life." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "When I was a young boy growing up behind the Iron Curtain, we could watch Finnish television at night, and we could hear Ronald Reagan." And he said his parents told him that Ronald Reagan was a great man and America is a great country. I had the chance to see the power of faith and freedom. When I was in Kenya in the mid-'80s, Pope John Paul II visited. And I went and listened to him talk about his faith, and learned later, obviously, when I was working in Poland, about the differences that he'd made there. But one of the most moving experiences that I've had was visiting with Pope John Paul II and my father in about 2004. And he grabbed my dad's hand, and he looked into his eyes, and he said, "God bless the United States of America." And I know that God has blessed us. God has blessed America. But our freedom will only survive if we protect it, if we take our duty and our obligation seriously. Today, we're facing threats to our freedom abroad, around the world, and here at home. And the list of these threats is not insubstantial. From Russia to China to Iran, to North Korea. American adversaries are certainly on the march. We had some good news within just the last 48 hours or so that Sweden and Finland will become members of NATO. And I think it's an important lesson to Vladimir Putin, that is the opposite of what he had expected. If he had hoped that his invasion would lead to weakening NATO, he's managed to expand NATO. And I think that's an important message. Here at home, we have significant challenges as well. The Biden administration economic policies have contributed to the worst inflation in 40 years. We're watching the expansion of government regulation that kills jobs and economic growth. And the situation at our southern border is unsustainable. It's dangerous and it is reckless, and we must get control of our southern border. I'm a conservative Republican, and I believe deeply in the policies of limited government, of low taxes, of a strong national defense. I believe that the family is the center of our community and of our lives, and I believe those are the right policies for our nation. But I also know that at this moment, we are confronting a domestic threat that we have never faced before, and that is a former president who is attempting to unravel the foundations of our constitutional republic. And he is aided by Republican leaders and elected officials who've made themselves willing hostages to this dangerous and irrational man. Now, some in my party are embracing former President Trump. And even after all we've seen, they're enabling his lies. Many others are urging that we not confront Donald Trump, that we look away. And that is certainly the easier path. One need only look at the threats that are facing the witnesses who've come before the January 6th committee to understand the nature and the magnitude of that threat. But to argue that the threat posed by Donald Trump can be ignored is to cast aside the responsibility that every citizen, every one of us bears to perpetuate the republic. We must not do that, and we cannot do that. Ronald Reagan said it is up to us in our time to choose, and to choose wisely between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day. No party and no people and no nation can defend and perpetuate a constitutional republic if they accept a leader who's gone to war with the rule of law, with the democratic process, or with the peaceful transition of power, with the Constitution itself. As the full picture is coming into view with the January 6th committee, it has become clear that the efforts Donald Trump oversaw and engaged in were even more chilling and more threatening than we could have imagined. As we have shown, Donald Trump attempted to overturn the presidential election. He attempted to stay in office and to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power. He summoned a mob to Washington. He knew they were armed on January 6th. He knew they were angry. And he directed the violent mob to march on the Capitol in order to delay or prevent completely the counting of electoral votes. He attempted to go there with them. And when the violence was underway, he refused to take action to tell the rioters to leave. Instead, he incited further violence by tweeting that the Vice President, Mike Pence, was a coward.